I'll start with one reading, the Robert Orsi reading, which really deeply spoke to me, even though he's talking about snake handlers in Appalachia. I'm dealing with popular religion in southeastern coastal China. But there's one quote that I would like to read from his text. He says, 19th and early 20th century American religious studies scholarship on Hindu ritual echoed with anti-Catholic contempt for corporal religious idioms and revealed less about religious practices in South Asia than about internecine European hatreds. It became one medium for construing the peoples dominated by European nations. So what he's talking about is the normalization of religion in religious studies as a discipline, that unconsciously religious studies as a discipline has sought to differentiate between good religions and bad religions. So bad religions are those weird snake handlers in Appalachia, and good religions are the proper mainline Protestants going to church. So we live in the 20th century, we live in an increasingly globalized world beginning in the 20th century. And it was for me, how this piece really spoke to me is that all the way in China, I was experiencing what Robert Orsi has talked about, because the big hand of modern Western thought about religion and religiosities has spread all the way to China. And the Communist Party doesn't know about this, but they have been completing the missionaries' work in China, and they did it with a vengeance, and they did it much better and much more effectively than the Western missionaries ever could have dreamed of, because they are Chinese themselves. So when they act to destroy popular religion, it's considered the nationalist project, where if the Western missionaries who wanted to also had a very, very dim view of Chinese popular religion, if they had the opportunity to do it, of course, there would be an uprising. So even though the Chinese Communist Party is very suspicious of Christianity today, because of its associations with Western imperialism, they don't realize how much they have absorbed of this kind of Protestant movement to secularization, this kind of mode of thinking, which, for example, in China, the opposition between superstition, the category of superstition, and religion is still going on. It's very important since the beginning of the 20th century down to the present. So deep is it that it's got two different sets of bureaucracies handling superstition on the one hand and religion on the other hand. There are 5 officially recognized religions in China, only 5. And everything else is superstition. So the 5 are Buddhism, Taoism, Protestantism, Catholicism, and Islam. Everything else is technically superstition. So bureaucratically, the State Administration of Religious Affairs handles religion, and religion does enjoy freedom of religion in China, in the Chinese Constitution, although that's not always put into practice, but still it's there. But superstition, and this is the religion of the people, the masses of the Chinese people, such as shamanism, ghost worship, ancestor worship, deity worship, geomancy, nature worship, and so forth. And divination, these forms of religiosities are not recognized as proper religiosities. And superstition is handled by public security, the police, because technically it's illegal. So usually, fortunately, most local officials kind of just look the other way and tolerate it, but they can, at any moment's notice, just tear down a deity temple if they wish. So we live in a very interconnected world. So this is something that is not just a problem in the United States, but also very much a problem in China, that indigenous forms of religiosities, Chinese tradition is a polytheistic kind of a religious culture, many gods and goddesses. So the tragedy for me that I see is that in destroying its own popular religions, it destroyed the foundations of local communities and the foundations of indigenous civil society, and allowed the state to, throughout the 20th century, to steamroller its way into the grassroots level, whereas the imperial Chinese state didn't penetrate very deeply into grassroots. It stopped at the county level. With Martin Buber's piece, his argument is that Judaism is unique amongst the Middle Eastern religions of its time, in that whereas for most polities, you had a divine being who authorized or sanctioned a monarch. But the ancient Israelites envisioned a direct theocracy ruled by Yahweh, who wrote the laws himself. So the Jews, for Martin Buber, have a religious idea of a folk kingship kind of a god. So Judaism then serves as a prime example of what ancient religious nationalism, in that it's both a religion as well as the ancient Jewish state. So today, what we call, some of us are kind of getting quite excited in the notion of political theology that Giorgio Agamben and before him Carl Schmitt have brought up. In political theology, there's no real separation between the state and nation and religion, even if the state ostensibly regards itself as secular and has many separation between church and state, religion and state structurally there. This notion of political theology is very pertinent, I think, because if we go along with Durkheim, any social formation, small like a local community, or gigantic like modern nation states, still needs the category of the sacred, right? Because that's the definition of society or any social formation or political formation. You need that category of the sacred. So people like Robert Bellah has written about American civil religion that seems kind of unconscious, whereas American civil religion derives from Hebraic and Christian traditions, but American civil religion invokes God. We have on our bill, "In God We Trust," and every political leader in the United States needs to invoke God. But it's not very narrowly Christian because Jesus is usually left out. So now, Talal Assad's essay takes a very different, and I'm still struggling with his essay, Secularism, Nation State, and Religion. He takes a very different tact where he wants to have a hard dividing line between religion and nationalism. And he gives various examples, mainly based on Christianity and Islam. So in Islam, for one example, religion has limited nation state. Nationalism, its conception of its territory and its spatiality is delimited, because that's what nation states are. We have hard boundaries and very strict borders today. But something like Islam, it appeals to the ummah, the Islamic community, which is very transnational, translingual, transcultural, and so on. So he wants to keep this hard and fast division. But in looking at China, I would say that China, both in its past and its immediate foreseeable future, the dividing line is not going to be clear at all. That religion and the state are going to be very much blended. And I just wrote a piece recently about how I see the foreseeable immediate future of China, that there will be no state and religion division. The state, for example, since 2006, has been running these training schools for religious leaders of the 5 recognized religions who go to People's University, and they go through a 4-month training program, taking classes by state officials as well as secular intellectuals, so that they will know how to lead their religious communities in accordance with what the state sees as important. So these kinds of things are very much there. And actually, speaking of Robert Bellah, who was one of my PhD advisors at Berkeley, he died last month. And I belong to a Chinese blog, and some Chinese intellectuals have been able to read the writings of Robert Bellah, and they spoke with him when Robert Bellah died. They spoke with him with such veneration because of that American civil religion piece. And I think it's because they really are in search of something. Right now in China, Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, MLM I call it, is just not working, because the ideology that has kept China together for several decades now, there's too much of a jarring contradiction with the lives that people live. China has such a polarized rich and poor society. It is the largest market for luxury goods in the world right now. So you cannot keep on, spouting Marxism, Leninism, given that situation. So, Confucius, this is what they probably need, or probably will. I have mixed feelings about Confucianism, but he has served for over 2,000 years. And I think it's likely that they will bring him back as a civil religion. You need a civil religion to motivate people, to bring people together, and when nationalism can tap into much deeper historical depths and layers of religion, traditional religions, as American civil religion, which Bellah wrote about, then it's much more powerful. It works much better. Just secular nationalism, I don't think it can last too long. So anyway, that's my thought about Buber. And I really remember in Israel, I went to Masada, and I really saw the seamless conjoining of religion, a very ancient religion, and very modern nationalism. Every schoolboy and girl in Israel today goes up to Masada with a school trip to inculcate nationalism and deep religiosity, and it's a seamless conjoinment there. So now Habermas, I have mixed feelings about this piece by Habermas, even though his public sphere work is very important. For me, Habermas seems he's playing the reasonable sort of middle road between the radical, assertive secularists who don't want anything tainted by religion, and the crazy relativistic, cultural relativist, multiculturalist who are trying to bring in religion. So he plays this reasonable role. But his vision of religion seems to me quite skewed, perhaps by the present moment in Europe. He basically presents religion as this very dangerous, irrational force because he's such a spokesperson for the Enlightenment. He castigated the French theorists like Foucault and Derrida and so on as neoconservatives, and he upholds the Enlightenment. Okay, that's fine, and we are all children of the Enlightenment today. But Enlightenment can also get out of hand. I mean, there's disagreements about just... Anyway, I saw Habermas as having a very jaundiced view of religion, maybe coming out of also the emergence of the state, the modern state in Europe after the 80 years of religious wars. So I think it's this attitude towards religion, a very limited attitude towards religion as those irrational crazies and violent people who just want to take over. And if you only have this kind of view towards religion, then of course you're going to have problems with all kinds of religious forces. I think religion is much more than that. So actually, for Habermas's piece, I saw the difference between Europe and the United States. This country here was settled by a lot of people fleeing religious persecution. So it's kind of in the DNA of a lot of American culture, freedom of religion, tolerance for different religions. Of course, there's intolerance too, but in general, we see veils all the time, but veiling is such a big issue in Europe. So even though they're both Western cultures, but on this issue, there's such a huge difference, whereas the United States is still so religious, but Europe is one of the exceptions in the world of remaining very secular. Now, the last piece, of course, Benjamin Schwartz, writing about a 19th century Chinese scholar, Yan Fu, who was steeped in Confucian education but went abroad to Europe and got a Western education. He translated very major writers such as Thomas Huxley, introduced the whole notion of social evolutionism into China in the 19th century. He translated Herbert Spencer and Adam Smith. He was very admiring of the dynamism, the energy, and the assertiveness of the West. Of course, China was a basket case at that time. It felt very weak and secure as it was being taken over by Western imperialists. It was in danger of being carved up amongst the Western powers. And then later in the 20th century, you had Japanese, first encroaching, then full-scale invasion. So China in the 19th and 20th centuries, kind of like Assyria today, very bad situation. And Yan Fu talks about he wanted China to become strong, wealthy, and powerful, in search of wealth and power. And Schwartz, had a very interesting approach where he kept on using these words Promethean and Faustian as he was thinking about Yan Fu. And now, in Greek myth, Prometheus was the guy who stole fire from the gods and then was punished by Zeus. Zeus would eat his liver every day, and then every day the liver would grow back, only to be painfully eaten by Zeus again. So that was Prometheus' punishment. Faust, he really wanted knowledge, and he would give anything to acquire knowledge. And so he made a pact with the devil where he would get all this knowledge and pleasure, and then at a certain moment when he'd reached his peak, the devil would claim his soul. So they both had to pay a price for this incredible desire for wealth and power. So I think this speaks to me very much because, for one thing, Schwartz points out that pursuit of wealth and power was a line of thought. This very phrase came out of the legalist. Legalism was in ancient China that was one of the competitors to Confucianism in the history of ancient Chinese philosophy. It was a statecraft, basically Machiavellian thought way back in BC time, okay? So, but in the Han Dynasty, about 100 years before Christ, what happened was that Confucianism and legalism were melded together. So ever since, it's been a kind of uneasy kind of interaction between them. And so what has happened in modern China is in its single-minded pursuit of wealth and power for the Chinese nation, which was at one time called the poor man of Asia. It was weak and decrepit and old and tired. It was willing to give up everything. And one thing, of course, it gave up was its very deep and religious tradition. And so the price that China, and today China, of course, is extremely powerful economically. I have to say, it was made powerful by stamping down religion. It didn't have the Protestant Reformation, so first the Kuomintang, then the communists tried to destroy religion. Almost succeeded. Especially the communists were the most active there. But the price they have paid is one that for popular religion, which was very important in bringing together social solidarity in local communities, when their gods and goddesses and temples were destroyed, that means their icons of local community was destroyed. And that meant that civil society or indigenous civil society was destroyed, and very easy for the state to steamroller right into every grassroots community. That was one price that was paid. Another price was China is in a spiritual vacuum, and people in China complain about it. They say, we need religion. People are behaving unethically. Now, for a time, they could use Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought to get people to act ethically. But now that rings hollow. But now they're bereft. So there is this kind of spiritual emptiness in China, and a lot of people without ethics running around, with no direction except the greenback, the money. Okay, there's the worship of money in China. So those are two prices paid. In many ways, Chinese state socialism was the best preparation for global capitalism, right? First, you have a state that closes in on itself and then mobilizes its citizens. The ideology of historical materialism, that's the best preparation. I mean, that's like doing the Reformation in a few decades' time. China was always racing and racing to catch up with the West. Now it has arrived, but there's an emptiness there. And that's the pace that the price that it paid. So those are how I see. I have more to say, but maybe in the question and answers. I think I've taken too much time. Sorry.
That was a great opening. So thank you very much for that. And I also want to thank Lee and the co-organizers for inviting me to be part of this very interesting conversation, and the U of A English Department for the genius of bringing Lee here so that I could come specifically to Tucson and get to see old friends as well as make some new ones for this project. So thank you, all of you. I'm going to approach this a little differently. As Lee mentioned, I've been thinking about these questions about religion and secularism for a long time. And so my approach to the readings comes out of the project that he mentioned called Secularisms, which was a collaborative project that began actually in 1998 with scholars that worked on different traditions in the United States, India, China, Iran, Turkey, and Great Britain. And that was co-edited with my friend and colleague, Anne Pellegrini. And so I want to just lay out a couple of the insights from that book in relation to the readings and some of what Mayfair has said. I was hoping she would go first so that at certain points I could cut down on time by saying what she said. And then talk about the readings in relation to a set of questions about the US public sphere, which is where I do most of my research. Okay, the basic insight of the book Secularisms is that religion and secularism are interrelated, mutually constituted concepts. And so, as Mayfair was saying, some people have viewed religion and secularism, or the state and religion, as fundamentally divided terms. So you know that the definition of secularism comes out as it's not religion, or the definition of religion is that it's not secularism. But the argument of the anthology is actually that secularism may be understood as that which is not religion, but it actually depends on the very religion from which it is distinguished. So that in any given circumstance, whether you're thinking about Hinduism in India or Christianity in the United States, the way in which a secularism develops in a particular area depends upon the religion it is set in terms of. So certainly when thinking about the United States, one can think about a specifically Christian version of secularism as predominant. In the earlier book that Anne and I did, Love the Sin, we trace Christian secularism through the ways in which Christian norms and values frame possibilities for US law and policy in the United States. And basically, if you look at Supreme Court decisions on sexuality in the United States, and the question is, should we regulate sexuality? And the answer is yes. The reason is because religion. That's just what they all say. It's quite striking. And the Supreme Court has also ruled on the question not just of the separation of church and state, but on the status of religion itself, so that they ruled that the display of religious symbols at public expense or on public property at Christmas time is an essentially secular act. So for the court, Christmas has become a secular commercial holiday, and the religious effects of this display of Christian symbols are, in the words of the court, quote, indirect, remote, and incidental. Anne does this with, she does acts out the war on Christmas with hand puppets at this point, but I'm not that good. So, in other words, the U.S. public sphere may be secular, right? This is what the court is saying. It's a secular site. It may be commercial, even in ways that are impervious to religious influence, as when commercial broadcasters ignore the claims of religious advocates, right? This often happens around sexuality. Nevertheless, even this secularism is Christian in form. In fact, when it comes to public life, Christianity gets to have it both ways in the United States. Christian practices and claims can float. They're sometimes marked as overtly religious when that's beneficial, for example, around questions of tax status, and at other times they are secular, as in this display of Christmas objects on public property at Christmas time. That's secular, and then sometimes it's religion, sometimes claiming Christianity is religious and therefore tax exempt. So this is what we're looking at, is the ways in which religion and secularism come to define each other in a specific way. And in thinking about this, and just to, again, draw on what Mayfair has already so helpfully laid out for us, when we think about Christian secularism, we are thinking of it as a different formation than religion itself, and even than civil religion. So, for example, in the 1967 essay when Bella writes about civil religion, one of his primary examples is from presidential inaugural addresses that draw upon images of God. And so what he's talking about is the ways in which this drawing upon God is not specific to a particular religion, it's a more national religion. For us, that the way in which we would distinguish what we call Christian secularism from civil religion is by thinking not about the way in which presidents in their inaugural addresses draw upon the idea of God, but the ways in which they draw upon ideas that are specifically Christian in form, but that are nonetheless secular. So, for example, in his second inaugural, George Bush said the word freedom something like 23 times in a 20-minute speech. And so the question is, what does he mean by this? And the Christian secular analysis of it would be that this invocation of freedom brings together Protestant ideas of freedom with a particular market secular understanding of freedom, and that it's this combination, in fact, between Protestantism and a secular market approach to the world that is the Republican coalition that elects George Bush twice, or certainly the second time. So it's the sense in which freedom here is drawn upon as a secular term, and yet it's a specifically Protestant term that has specifically Protestant power. So that he doesn't have to say God 20 times in a 20-minute speech. Freedom, it does that work. And that's the difference between an idea of specific secularism and a broader civil religion, so that we would see the possibility of both taking place. In other words, there is, one could argue there is a civil religion in the United States, and that there is also a specific secularism that is in the form of Protestantism. And so what we thought about then in the project as a whole was the ways in which this kind of very specific US Christian secularism that I was just talking about was related to other secularisms in the world. So, for example, Geeta Patel, in her essay in the volume, offered a meditation on the workings of India during the government of the BJP, and she shows how time in particular, the way that time is understood, is marked by Hinduism, by a Hindu calendar, and by Hindu nationalism, and that relates then to time as marked by the Protestant secularism of global capitalism. In other words, the calendar, the time that is used for global capitalism, is a specifically Christian calendar. So she wants to think about the way in which Hindu nationalism comes together in relation to global capitalism, and she argues that in fact it's by suturing Hindu nationalism to Hindu secularism that the BJP was able to accomplish the Constitution of India as simultaneously the true site of Hindu identity and an ultramodern capitalist powerhouse. So that the resurgence of religion in some quarters has been understood as somehow anti-modern or anti-capitalist. Her argument is that in fact it's the connection of Hindu nationalism to a certain form of Christian secularism that allows for this new social formation. So in sum, religion and secularism in this argument are mutually constituted through relations that are multiple, meaning that they are constituted not through singular categories, this is religious, this is secular, but rather they are multiple in that they are related to each other. So, for example, Hindu secularism relates to relates to Christianity. It relates to Hinduism, which then relates to Christian secularism. So both forms of religion and secularism relate to each other in a complex relation. All of these interactions then constitute what we study as religion and secularism. And these relations are also dynamic. With the rise, for example, of a politicized right wing in the US, Christianity begins to look more like conservative evangelicalism and less like moderate evangelicalism or mainline Protestantism as it was analyzed in the 1950s in the United States. Similarly, with the rise of a politicized Hindu right in India, Hinduism becomes more important to secular formations in India, such as science and nationalism, which begin to take on Hinduism as a signifier, Hindu nationalism, or Banu Subramaniam has a piece in the anthology which is about Hindu science. Relations among religion and secularism are constituted thus through other types of relation, like those of nationalism. In other words, the religion-secular binary is not the only relation that constitutes secularism. Rather, a network of relations which include capitalism, nationalism, and other axes of social differentiation, such as gender and sexuality, race and class, work to constitute secularism. And the main point I want to make this evening is that any adequate analysis of religion and secularism, or any ethical or political action in the public sphere in relation to them, has to take up all of these axes of differentiation. Or what we run into is a problem in which some relation forms a ground on the basis of which other relations come to the fore. So that it basically, I'm trying to skip over some things here, but what I want to think about is the ways in which a focus on political belonging, which is the other term that's brought into play for the workshop, can create a sense in which we're focused on a singular dynamic, that of religion, secularism, or belonging and exclusion, which, as Mayfair again mentioned, is the focus of the Habermasian piece, or a relation between self and other. And this is the central relation that comes up in the chapter that she mentioned by Robert Orsi, which was offered as one of the foundational readings for the group. And the Orsi piece I like very much. I teach this piece, and Robert Orsi has been, as a scholar of religion, has been a big supporter of a lot of important and also feminist work in the academy. But in this particular piece, he argues for an openness to what are called bad religions, as Mayfair mentioned, on the basis of gender relations that go utterly unanalyzed in the piece. So for those of you who aren't in the workshop, just a little bit about how this works. He does argue for a form of religious studies which I fully support, which suspends in a certain way one's own value system in order to maintain the possibility of coming to know the others who have traditionally been the bad objects of religious studies. So he argues, as Mayfair laid out for you, that representatives of superstition, of cults, or of what are seen as strange cultic practices, and I left out a whole piece in which I analyzed the Boston Red Sox as part of these strange cultic practices, but you can imagine how that goes. Just grow a beard, it's fine. Or anything that's simply non-Christian, which is the normative side of comparative religions. So everything is normatively compared to Christianity. Orsi is making an ethical point, which is that the religion-secular divide is actually a divide between good religion and secularism, which are together on one side, and bad religion on the other side. So in the United States, rationalized religions are fine within the framework of secularism. It's just these bad religions that are excessive in some way or another, or not rationalized, that are the problem. So one of the things that secularism is supposed to ensure is the good appropriate practice of religion. This is Charles Taylor's argument, in which he argues that secularism is an immanent frame within which religious pluralism can take place. And Orsi wants to question the implication of religious studies scholars in depending on these bad objects to ensure the goodness of both religion and the study of it. So one of the things he's arguing about is that there is a ground that enables another set of social relations to take place on top of it. And that ground for him is bad religions. What I would like to argue, though, is that in this piece, gender forms the ground for his distinctions. So he takes up as a central example in the book a book by journalist Dennis Covington about the religious practice of snake handling in the United States. And this book reportedly does an admirable job of maintaining a sense of openness to a set of practices that have been traditionally seen as bad religion. And in various ways, these religions, and Orsi is very clear about this, not only are they not rationalized, but they're associated with rural and working class Americans, so there's a sense in which they're not central to the social formation of the United States as well. And yet, in the end of the book, this openness that Covington is able to show crumbles when a conflict emerges between a leading snake handler who's named Punkin Brown and Covington over the place of women in religious practice, and of Covington's colleague and photographer in particular. And this woman is never named in the text. So this is a very familiar narrative in which gender is used as the stopper for openness to non-dominant religions. This is one of the things that has happened in several of these EU controversies, right? And so you would think that this would be an opening to think about the work that gender does specifically in these very controversies. But instead, the gender aspect of the conflict goes utterly unanalyzed in Orsi's text. And this lack of analysis is actually quite profound, which is to say that if you were to look at calls for conferences in religious studies or the way that books are organized, gender and sexuality often form an example in this way, but are rarely brought in as central to the analysis. So the field as a whole tends to grow on the basis of examples that have to do with headscarves, that have to do with sexual relations, that have to do with marriage, that have to do with family, and yet gender and sexuality are not seen as central to the field. And then the second problem is that gender here forms for Orsi the very stability that he worries is by bad religion in other examples, right? So we have the very dynamic that he's criticizing, which is, but here gender replaces bad religion. And again, Orsi has been very supportive of feminist scholarship. Just as an example, in this essay, he cites Karen McCarthy Brown as exemplary of post-colonial scholarship, rather than someone like Edward Said, who Rosie Brodati cites in her essay. Yet in the narrative developed by Orsi, the stability of gender is the ground on which he builds his distinction, not just between good religion and bad religion, but between good religious studies and bad religious studies. My point in bringing up gender here is not simply to assert that feminism should carry the day. Again, that's a familiar argument, and I think that one would be right to be suspicious of the ease with which gender also constitutes the other side of this argument, that we should exclude religion from the public sphere precisely because it, bad religion, is bad for women. And that point, bad religion is bad for women, is often made in public not by feminists, but or by those who necessarily care about women, but for those who want a ground on which to exclude other people who are marked other, both women and men. So my point is that standing on the ground of gender maintains an ethical relation in which someone has to do the work of establishing an appropriate sense of self and relation for others. And this someone can be bad religion, or it can be gender. And this type of social relation in which a ground provides a sense of openness for a different set of social relations happens all the time. So we can see this, for example, in the US public sphere, most recently in the set of Supreme Court decisions that came down in the week of June 24th of this year. Just briefly, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these decisions. The first was on affirmative action at universities, and I would argue it does make some major shifts about relations between race and class. The second was about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that ruling essentially made the claim that the Voting Rights Act had been successful, racism was essentially over, and what we need, and therefore the major enforcement clause of the 1965 Civil Rights Act was no longer necessary. Congress could pass another one, but that enforcement clause was no longer necessary. And then the third decision declared the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional. So we have a whole set of social relations that come down all in the same week, and the Supreme Court picks what cases it hears, and it picks how it releases the decision. So, I think it's not too much of a stretch to say that there's a narrative arc here. And the narrative arc here goes with one way to think about political belonging in the United States, which is that one of the primary narratives about political belonging in the United States is democracy expands. And I can talk about how that runs from the beginning to the end, but this is our basic narrative. We have a progress narrative in which democracy is continually expanding. And many people read the third one of these decisions, the gay and lesbian rights decision, as an example of precisely that. Democracy is expanding anew, right? It's the new civil rights issue. But of course, the way in which it was framed in relation to the Voting Rights Act, and even the way in which the battle for same-sex marriage has been framed as a whole, in which same-sex marriage and gay rights are placed as analogous to racial justice and civil rights around race, sets up the sense in which gay and lesbian rights are the civil rights of the moment, and in fact, civil rights vis-a-vis race are completed. It's because they're completed that they can form the ground for gay and lesbian rights of the moment. And so the very narrative in which, in this case, gender and sexuality are set to open, they're the open site, and race provides the ground on which gay and lesbian rights can provide the openness. And we can talk some more, about the affirmative action case. I think it's actually all part of the same narrative. So that what I'm interested in is the way in which this narrative about political belonging, democracy expands, is like a bubble in which, yes, it expands over here, but in order to draw the bubble in this way, it's going to narrow someplace else. And I call that mobility for stasis. Where democracy is constantly expanding in the United States, it's not that these things are not happening, but it is that all of this mobility also reproduces contractions in other areas, such as the ones we've seen around race relations since the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which is to say that We did have desegregation of the schools. We've had resegregation of the schools. So our studies differ on this, but many say that they're as segregated as they were before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. We can say similar things about housing, and of course, incarceration has expanded massively during the last several decades, and that's been focused on African American and Latino men. So what that means is that there's been a contraction, literally, of the number of people who are in the US public sphere of color, and in particular of the ones who can vote. So that we see this real contraction of democracy, even as we have a narrative in which we've completed one step and we're moving on to the next step. So my sense, then, of how do we address this issue is that we need to think about whether political belonging, in the way that it's usually framed as a Habermasian public sphere, in which it's a question of are people in or out of this boundary, right, which is either expanding or contracting, may not be the best way to go, but rather to think about these multiple relations. So an alternative relational analysis can be understood as the type of rhizomatic ethics that Brodati is suggesting in the essay that went along with the Habermasian one. I developed this form of ethics more as a more Latourian than Deleuzian idea of assemblage, and I've been actually particularly influenced by Anne-Marie Moll's The Body Multiple, more than by the sort of Spinozian monism that Brodati describes. But perhaps the point is similar. Democracy doesn't expand, but it is enacted in a world that is also dominating, violent, beautiful and moving, multiple and singular, diverse and complex. In other words, from my position with the opportunity to speak with you this evening, it is part of a world that is well worth engaging. Thank you.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I have a very interesting talk, and I was just wondering, the second the speaker made a reference of Hinduism and the BJP. I haven't understood the correlation of BJP with Hinduism. As far as I'm concerned, I'm professional soldier. I spent 28 years in the Army, Indian Army. And I am of full conviction that secularism has no place for narrow religion. So the mention of BJP in a specific reference to Hindu nationalists is misconceived, can be misunderstood. And that is what is happening in today's polity, that secularism is being exploited to polarize, Hindus and Muslims. So I think we have to understand that BJP is a political party, nothing to do with Hinduism. The second thing, Hinduism is really not a religion. Hinduism is a way of life. It is a Sanatan Dharma. It is the eternal Dharma, duty. So it is now being talked about in a very narrow sense, and hence misunderstood. So I feel that very good debate. In secularism, we have to, if we have to have peace and happiness in the world, which is today totally disturbed, distorted. There's no peace at all, despite United Nations in being. There's no peace, and there can never be peace if we continue to mix religion with secularism or with democracy or running in the state. The need is spirituality, yes. So we should, whatever religion is there, the need is to take an extract of spiritualism and apply it to the management of the world. Thank you.
I mean, this is one of the things that where I think that Robert Orsi's book is particularly helpful, which is that he's interested in the ways in which the search for a true religion leads us as analysts to become morally invested, so that the very narrowing that the speaker was talking about, the ways in which a particular idea of religion becomes narrowed to a singular thing. This happens all the time with Christianity in the United States as well, where, you know, there are all kinds of positions vis-a-vis sexuality in Christianity, ranging from celibacy to various forms of openness. And yet the idea is that there's a singular idea of sexuality that is associated with Christianity. So part of what the analysis is trying to do is talk about how that narrowing happens, not to say this is Hinduism, here's an object, we know what it is, because that's not for us as scholars to say. You know, our job is much more to think about the ways in which social relations work, and, you know, for practitioners to think about what their commitments are in specifically religious terms. So what we're trying to think about is, how is it that a certain group, in particular political group, gets to claim particular religious positions as its own?
Yeah, I just have a quick addition to that. When you say that Hinduism is not a religion, it's a way of life, you know, I can understand where you're coming from, but I think the problem is not to go with the dominant definition of what religion is always what we should all do, especially non-Western societies, is always to question what is religion, because you know, we live in this world where Europe and North America had at one point been so powerful that they dominated the whole world and got the world, especially the elites of the world, to think in their way. So religion is one of those things. So in China too, people constantly debate, Confucianism is not religion, you know, but the thing is that it's only not religion because we have accepted the Protestant definition of religion. So I think one of the things that was missing in the readings was some reference to the post-colonial condition, where in all the post-colonies, the elites of the post-colonies, including China, especially China, accepted, very often unconsciously accepted the terminology, the definition, and the world view of the former colonizers, and absorbed them often without knowing that they absorbed them, and then proceeded to, you know, act on their own indigenous societies based on the expectations of Western culture. And so for me, looking at China, China has still got to get itself out of that mode of treating popular religion as stupid superstition that you need to stamp out.
Hello, my name is Ernst van den Hemel. I'm from Utrecht University. And if I am slightly less coherent than the previous speakers, it's because the clock on my computer says it's 5 o'clock in the morning. But first of all, thank you very much for two wonderful essays, and I'd like to, or readings, and I'd like to share some thoughts with you. And I wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit, because on the one hand, I would fully agree with the politicized role of religion and the problematic status of the intertwinement of secularism and religion. But on the other hand, what I'd like to suggest, or what I'd like to sketch, is a sort of the political instrumentalization of precisely that crisis. And what I mean by that is that in the Netherlands, for instance, a party is the biggest party in the polls right now that says, well, indeed, secularism is Christian in origin. It is Protestant. And we should not hide that, we should affirm that, which means that Dutch culture is inherently incapable of interacting with, well, Islamic culture, for instance. And it basically embraces this criticism of Protestantism and of secularism and creates a sort of what I've suggested to call a post-secular form of politics that seems to be impervious to some degree to the critique that you are launching. And by that, what I mean by that is that, for instance, gay rights, feminism, tolerance, these sort of ideals are co-opted. I said, well, this is what makes Judeo-Christian culture superior to Islam, right? Even down to the fact that critique, there's a wonderful book by Sabah Mahmoud and Talal Assad and Winnie Brown that say, well, that wonder, is critique secular, right? And that problem is very much alive in political reality in the Netherlands and perhaps in other countries in Western Europe, where this sort of post-secular predicament is effectively instrumentalized by the right. And whereas both scholars and engaged academics, they have a trouble in finding the right voice to interact with that. And criticism and scholarly work have its limits as far as political effectivity is concerned. So when we're talking about the problematic interaction between religion, secularism, and political belonging, I wonder whether that framing, successful framing of critique, scholarly work of secularism and religion should be taken into account. To the extent that, and that I'll end with a personal anecdote, I've tried this. I've tried critiquing the situation in the Netherlands, leading to the conservative prime minister of the Netherlands saying, yes, the interest in Judeo-Christian culture is so big that even a leftist postmodernist, which is me, has been converted, and he's writing about these topics now. He's writing about these topics now. In the 60s and 70s, they all wrote about Marxism, and now this guy is writing about, the Protestantism and Judeo-Christian culture. And he says, I might not agree with him, right? But the fact that he is entering into debate is a positive thing, because it shows that the debate concerning our religious roots is more alive than ever. And that was my attempt to critique precisely this framing, right? Which has troubled me ever since. So I don't have an answer, but I'd like to share that with you as part of the predicament that one might find oneself in. Because this framing, this immanent frame, is robust, right? And it includes critique, it includes irony, it includes many of these factors that I think we're discussing today. So.
Hi, I'm Ori. I'm from Tel Aviv. I share Ernst's scheduling predicament. I'm going to be talking about Buber's text to some extent in our workshop tomorrow, and well, he says several things about religiosity, although he talks about ancient religiosity, that struck me as interesting as I was listening to your very interesting presentations. And of course, the one thing that he seems to be saying is that religion, at least at some stage of the discussion about it, needs to be taken on its own terms. And that one of the methodological problems that he points out is that people actually have a hard time doing that. But once it is taken on its own terms, it turns out that it can encapsulate, it can hold that sort of pluralistic discussion that you were mentioning, Professor Jakobsen, about different relationships and different axes of relationships and connections all existing simultaneously. And in fact, I mean, the way he shows it, once you accept his basic premise that the ancient Israelites accepted God as their king, effectively, that this was a direct kingship of God, turns out that bringing eternity into the daily life of the people actually lets in a lot of contradiction and discussion and plurality. So I guess if I have a sort of question or something to think about, it's how is this relationship structured, the relationship between religion and secularisms, or should it be religions and secularisms? Because religion does have this innate flexibility within it, sort of a paradox, but it does have a kind of an integral, paradoxical understanding of the world, particularly with regard to politics. Perhaps this need to align religion and secularisms actually does some sort of injustice to religion by not allowing this built-in complexity to appear sort of suborning the principles of discussion to the way secularisms like to have these discussions carried out. You know, religion, I think, could potentially be radically constitutive enough to hold this discussion on its own. So just point for thought.
Just a couple things in response to that. About the way in which the framing, that the idea that secularism as Christian is taken up in the public sphere happens in the United States too. So that if you look, for example, Andrew Sullivan published an article on the that was the cover story of the New York Times Magazine on October 7th of 2001 that said this is a religious war, and it made precisely this argument, which was that secularism was Christian. And so the United States had a duty to go to war against politicized Islam in order to protect its Christian secular legacy. So that that sense that you can turn this idea, which reappears, I would argue, at various points historically, into political purposes that are varied, I think is a profound and important one. And I guess to kind of segue between these two pieces, for me then, the question of, is critique secularism, is critique secular, right? See, I'm only 3 hours different, and I still don't have any idea what I'm saying. Is critique secular, which, Amir Mufti has taken this up in a really interesting way out of Said's, idea of critique as a minority practice, which is that the argument is, well, it depends on what kind of critique you're talking about. And that any kind of critique, there are sort of 2 points here. One is that any kind of critique can be co-opted. And that's why, to me, it's so important to look at what is the ground of your argument, because it could easily be that the ground of your argument is that we should have gay and lesbian rights in a way that contributes to precisely the vilification of Islam, for example. That happens in the United States as well. But that what Mufti is trying to talk about is, what if we think of it as a minority practice? What if we think of critique, as coming from different sites? And then we don't have to have a framing that must be secular. But rather, religion can enter in all kinds of different ways, right? Because the reason, that I became a scholar of religion for all kinds of crazy reasons of my own, but part of it is that religion is a site where people do all kinds of really interesting things, right? They make the world in really interesting ways. And one of the things that the rationalized public sphere does is flatten all of that out. And so my sense is that, yes, I am, and Mayfair made this point so clearly, a child of the Enlightenment, right? I'm a feminist. I'm committed to certain forms of freedom, to justice, to peace. These are terms that I use in my daily practice. And yet they don't necessarily have to, so those are going to come into play in interactions that I participate in, but they don't have to be the framing values. They can be specific values that can then interact with religions, and they can be the smaller values in relation to perhaps other forms of bigger frames. And that's a very different way of approaching it then. We're going to figure out how to have this frame and somehow get away from the sense that, the difficulty, the problematic of Christian secularism. And it is a problematic because, my colleague at Columbia, Gil Anijar, is writing a book now that is basically just says secularism is so colonized by Christianity that you just have to let it go. His claim is very strong about the colonial history and the ways in which we can't have any form of secularism that isn't going to carry this taint. The argument that we make in secularisms is different, which is that secular formations are all different themselves. You can't escape this genealogy, the colonial legacy that Mayfair was talking about, but on the other hand, to then deny validity to these other forms of secularism as they have developed, and the ways and the things that they might contribute to this conversation too, seems like it would be a mistake.
For me, I haven't thought about this very much, but there are many religious traditions or sub-traditions or minority traditions of different religions that have, done a lot of questioning, reflecting. Before Enlightenment, you can't say that it's specifically critical, but it is in a critical spirit. And then is Christianity the only religion that has that gave birth to secularism? And, so I say no, of course not. Confucianism was a very ancient, pre-modern, one could say, secular tradition, even though, it never was atheist in that it did not deny the gods and the ancestors. It was really into ancestors, in fact. But it just said, don't overdo it. Don't, obsess about the gods. Keep them at a distance, because, it was much more this worldly. But it is a religious tradition that had all the makings of a secular. But it was put out of commission in the modern age due to colonizing forces and self-colonizing forces. It was put out of commission, so we don't know how it could develop and contribute to a global secularism, but it is possible. Yeah, so I'm sure maybe if we put our heads together, there are other religious traditions that have a kind of secular spirit. And I think all religions have a questioning tradition or multiple questioning traditions. I think the Jewish one has medieval Jewish European thought had that questioning spirit. What do you call it? I'm not very good at it. There's a movement in medieval Jewish European thought that was very rich. So anyway, I don't know the term for it. Yeah, and I think Islam has many traditions. So yeah, we can't allow only one religion to claim the possibilities for secularism.
Thank you for the wonderful conversation. I'm Karen Seat, the director of the Religious Studies program here at the University of Arizona, and welcome back, Janet. Janet started her career here at UA, so it's great to see you. And welcome to all of you here. We're delighted to have you here. And I just have a couple things I wanted to say. I'm currently working on a project about conservative evangelicals in American public space, and done a lot of field research and starting the work of the book manuscript. But I do struggle some with the challenge of ORSI to, especially in this project, to move away from talking about good religion and bad religion, and trying to think about, is there a ground from which an academic can critique religion and without falling into these traps that we've been talking about. So that's one interest of mine in this conversation is what is our purpose as academics in looking at this? Is it to just complicate and paint more complex pictures or to disrupt frames? Or do we also have a critique or some kind of vision that or something that comes out of this? And one question I would have for you, this is a really exciting and unique opportunity to have all these international scholars come together and think about these really important issues. And I would be interested to know what you would like to see come out of this RelSec project and what you think would be some of the most exciting kind of conversations we might continue in the next 2-year period while we undertake this project. Thank you.
I have a questions about that appears in both talks and in many recent literature about forms of secularisms or with the plurality, and I wanted to ask what the form of these forms. I mean, what allows these forms as variations on the same theme, and how we distinguish that this is a form of secularity, so that allows the many to be in the same unity. Why this is not another thing, and if there is a form of the forms, then probably we can, the category of the secular still has a critical bite beyond the many that inhibit it. sort of the difference between concept and conceptions. There are different conceptions of secularism, but there's one concept. So when we speak about secularism, we know we're not talking about happiness. We know what we're talking about, and what the things that allows that we know what we're talking about. So this is one thing that I think would be helpful to address, because I think might come up many times in all of the discussions of all the groups. And the second, if you can do some effort to connect some of the themes of the project and your talks, and this is the category of belonging and religion and the secular. And probably you mentioned nationalism in your talk. And so we have four words here floating in the air. And does the idea of belonging, it's more spatial metaphor, or it's spiritual one, or what? I mean, the category of belonging, if you try to connect it to the secular, the religious, and the national.
Should we answer? Okay.
Four questions.
Okay, so, we should deal with all the questioners, or?
Yeah, I mean, I was.
Okay, I'm not sure I remember all of them, but, so I remember best the last one, so sorry. How do we know? Well, I think for a lot of the non-Western world, secularism arrived suddenly, and so it was sometimes imposed on them, and they just had to go with it in a very rapid period of time. They didn't have the luxury to evolve it out of the Reformation, like the West. So, for example, with a place I'm familiar with, like China, nationalism was the new secularisms, because people, the educated elites, they were very concerned about the fate of China. It looks like cultural extinction, being carved up, and so on. So, like this biography of Yanfu says that they were looking for solutions. They were looking for ways to enable the survival of the civilization, and they, became extremely nationalist, and Yanfu, of course, was the person who introduced social evolutionism to China, and that was a very secularizing move. Social evolutionism did a lot of damage to religions, different kinds of religions in China, because it portrayed all of Chinese religions as backward. And the elites accepted that in their desire to make the state strong and powerful, wealthy and powerful. So their secularism was also Marxism. So Marxism is a form of social evolutionism. And so it was through revolution that it occurred. So that's a different path to secularism. And it was not exactly from Christianity. It was indirectly Christian, but it was through Marx, too. So that's a different kind of secularism. That's one example. There are many other. I think in India, it was also through colonizing force that secularism was introduced, but it had to mesh with native Hindu practices. The other thing about belonging, for me in my work, it's belonging also suggests a broad approach to citizenship. So for me, working on popular religion, that's the religion of the common people. So the Chinese communists were, they did help the peasantry a lot, but they also did a lot of damage to peasant culture and the intactness and autonomy of peasant communities by destroying popular religion. So, and looking down on popular religion because they had, you know, absorbed this social evolutionist way of thinking that had a hierarchy of religions in the world. From the Hottentots, who were the most backward, and the Australian Aborigines, they're regarded as the most backward of all people. In the 19th century, social evolutionism, that was the way, and this is what China picked up. So peasants, even though they're supposed to be the authors of the communist revolution, they ended up not really being regarded as fully belonging because they're so backward. They have this backward religion, and by not being able to have their community religions intact, they kind of became just proletariats ordered around by the communist officials. So they lost their ability to form their own initiatives, local initiatives, and so on, without their religion. So for me, that's where political belonging comes up, is in traditional forms of Chinese civil society was lost in the top-down kind of revolutionary secularism that came.
That's very helpful, and I just want to follow up briefly on the question of secularisms, and then come back to the question of the purpose of studying religion, and also what might come out of this project. I understand secularisms differently, which is to say that I'm using, I think, a different theory of language than the one that you're using, which is I don't see either religion or secularism as categories of which things are then instances of a previously definitional category. Rather, I understand things as definitional relationally. So there is no, here's the category and here are the instances thereof. That would be my critique of both the world religions comparative approach, in which Protestantism does form the definition of the category, and it sets up all kinds of problems. Is baseball a religion? What about non-theistic religions? I mean, these are questions that are set up by that approach. So what I think about is what's relational between religion and secularism, and then what's relational amongst these instances as they come up. And this, you could think of this in a Wittgensteinian sense, where it's a family, we have a family resemblance, so we know what we're talking about when we say red, not because there's a definition of red, there's a definitional color from which we can derive everything, but because they are, sort of in the same family. And that leaves your borders very blurry. Right, you're always going to have things at the borders that are blurry, which is one then of the questions about belonging, which is the belonging sets up a sense in which the borders and what's inside and outside of the borders are absolutely crucial to the entire enterprise, whereas a relational approach could allow for both this sense that you don't have to have a definitional site to which everything will compare, and that becomes then a normative project, but rather that you can have interrelations that form the project as a whole, and then there can be all kinds of other interrelations at the boundaries. So the boundaries aren't an in or out question, and that's the rhizomatic thing that Deleuze is talking about, and that Brodati takes up, and that's where I think the rhizomatic approach is helpful. There are other ways in which I find it less helpful, but I think in that sense in which what you connect to around your borders are other sets of relations, right? It's not an outside there be dragons, but rather, which is how it tends to run anyway, right? So that belonging then doesn't become as high price, it doesn't have the kind of high price to it that it might otherwise. In terms of what's the purpose of studying religion, I think this really varies. And I think that that's one of the big questions that Orsi wants us to ask, so that when he says, religion isn't necessarily good, religion isn't necessarily bad, he's really talking about the category there. He's trying to say religious actors do all kinds of things. They make wars and they make peace. They seem to do both these things with regularity. And so the sense that he wants to get at is, why are we studying religion? And I would say that question varies. I have feminist reasons, for studying religion, which does change my approach, both in the sense that the feminist critique of knowledge is central to my critique of religion as well, and in the sense that the project that I have does have a vision to it that is specific and that has specific ethical values behind it, freedom, justice, peace, et cetera, as I was saying. But I think that really varies, depending on what your theory of knowledge is, what your critique of knowledge is, and then how you want to approach that vis-a-vis religion. And I think that, these questions that have come up tonight are just so exciting about what the project might become. And in the sense of the ways in which these terms, you have 4 terms, which is already a lot, and they're mobilized in all different kinds of ways in today's world. So what's really exciting to me about the project that you're undertaking is the chance to talk, at length about the ways in which these terms are mobilized. Because they have effects that are not determined by their definitions. That's the difference between my theory of language, but they're determined by the use that they're put in the relationships that they make when they're put to those uses. So, that's a different way perhaps of looking at it, but it does make it very exciting to think about what's happening with these particular terms. And we had another question over here too.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think you stood up first, actually. I'll follow you. Go after you. Go ahead. You stood up first. I saw you standing up first.
Hi, I am a historian of South Asia, so we have been talking about that all this while. So my question was that secularism and religious, this binary, may be seen as a certain kind of disposition that we are seeking to cultivate or have been trying to do that in various places, parts of this world over the last maybe century more, depends on how you track that. So, which does not obviously take away from the possibility that other traditions in different parts of the world, more prominently, at least because maybe I'm more familiar with, is the Islamic hegemony in South Asia, had possibilities of something similar. Now, what I believe this particular kind of European-inspired secularism, not in all instances, but mostly, has done in some strange ways, has taken away the possibility of, say, if in history, if Islam and what we call Hinduism or whatever smaller traditions within Islam, how they could relate to each other by introducing religion as complete, packed, and ready to deliver good for its consumers. Do you think it has done away with the possibility for these traditions, which could relate to each other, to relate to each other now, which probably is one reason why, at least in South Asia, in my opinion, we see, it is not possible, there is no reason for a Hindu or a Muslim to translate to each other because they want to translate to secularism. That is the discourse in which they want to situate themselves. So is that a global phenomenon? Do you have something similar in China? Confucianism, Islam, or at least in. I wonder if that has that could be something that could be compared with in other instances.
So you're asking if the presence of secularism prevents the different religious communities
what
from
we now
talking to
call
each other.
religious traditions,
from talking to each other,
from
engaging.
talking to each other, or is that am I overstating my case? I just wonder.
No, I think you make a really excellent point to think about. I think definitely just looking at China, definitely they all have to speak to the secular state first. That's the most important avenue of communication. And there really is not very much, as far as I know, of the religions talking to each other, because the state has set itself up as the ultimate mediator as well as authority on everything. So in China, it does. The secular presence does prevent it. And globally, I think that's a very good point too. That globally, we're all these religions are under various nation states, and it's nation states who talk to each other. And religions, I think. It seems that we have it in our mind that religions tend to fight each other.
Yes.
And there's something causing these religions to fight each other so much. I think that they are fighting more with each other in modern times than they were before, because we have many examples where people live side by side of different religions, but once you have nationalism, they can't get along. So I think nationalism also gets in the way, because nationalism, all these traditional dynastic empires were much more tolerant of religious difference, because so long as you paid your taxes and you didn't rebel, whatever you do, you know, the empire was not, whether it's a Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, or other empires, it was, you know, covering so many multiple religious, cultural, linguistic communities. And they were basically left to follow their old ways. But once nationalism comes, it insists on homogeneous culture. It insists on one or two national languages. It insists on this kind of standardized culture, and everyone having to conform. I think that has caused a lot of interreligious conflicts.
I also have a little comment about that. I also think you made an excellent case. As I am from China and doing a little research on concerning the information freedom and internet censorship there, with such a strong overarching secularist state that very limits the possibility of communication in a public sphere, those religions who either are silent and those who actively go out of their ways to communicate with other religions are usually left with the most fanatic of their own devotions, and which gives way to a lot of disharmony and a speech of hatred. And I think that's a repercussion of a overarching secularism that does limit communication in a way. So I'm an undergrad student in U of A, majoring in global study. The scholars here are building their palace of knowledge, and I'm still digging holes in the ground and putting concretes. So thank you for listening to my basic questions as the ones that were asked before. And I am very interested in critique of religion. As you both of you have said, it's complicated and makes the world a beautiful and interesting place. I wonder, as Professor Jameson has mentioned, Charles Taylor said that secularism is a frame in which polytheism cannot take place. And I think part of that is because the secularism we are talking about is becoming so Christian. But if we critique from the opposite angle, using secularism based coming from some other worldviews, then they may just as well become a frame in which monotheism cannot take place. And if people critique it from the angle of nationalism, we may also come to critique it from the angle of feminism, and which makes me wonder if we have to combine so many threads of axes together in our study of religion and secularism. Doesn't that make the very study of religion or secularism itself a religion or a secularism? And do you believe that, therefore, the critique of religion must go beyond religion? And is it ever possible that it does go beyond it? Because when we say that, the ultimate goal of studying about it is to create a more happy world that actually aligns with a lot of religion's ideas. If we say that the way we do it is, as some of the early Chinese activists said, the way we do it is to eliminate some some of the backward religions that also align with the claim of some religions. And if we say we do it in order to say that all religions are equal and no right and no scale of better and worse, that actually also align with some other religions' claims. So, which leads to my question: do you think the very academic study of religion and secularism itself actually is a religion or secularism generated from it? Thank you. You know, before I build palaces, I better make sure my foundations are all flat here. Okay.
Yes?
Hello, I'm Professor Albrecht Klaassen. I'm Professor of Medieval Culture and Literature, and I wonder about 2 points. A, I wonder whether we really have something like secularism. I actually doubt that there is anything like that ultimately. Because if you think, for example, about Russia, how quickly they returned to Orthodox religion after the fall. But let me ask my question from a medieval perspective. I have the feeling that whenever we talk about secularism and religion, we forget that we're talking about evolution. Every religion goes through many different stages of evolution. And even at the sort of the high point maybe of religious fervor, let's say 12th century during the Crusades, you had so much secular criticism or so much internal conflicts. So if you think about, I know mostly medieval church, that went through so many different cycles, and when you think that they had reached, let's say, the papacy, the highest peak of their power, in reality, there were so many opponents and so much criticism and so much unrest and so much disrespect and so much anti-clericalism. So I would regard this really as a form of evolution. And we're always going in cycles. And at times when there's the most secularism, really that's the springboard for a new religious fervor. Thank you.
Well, that's what this notion of political theology is trying to get at, that, you know, maybe, you know, all these secular states that we have today in the modern world, it still has this they still all have this religious dimension. They still have to work with this category of sacredness to keep a social formation together. And so in that way, we are never, just so long as we are human, we're not able to really leave religious sentiment. But we can have many different forms of religion and religions that are institutionalized to different degrees. Religions that are some religions are less influential and have less social impact than others. Right now, I'm very taken with this idea that for all our modernity and secularisms, we still have to deal with religion. That religion is still with the human species, so we have to figure out what is the best way to deal with it. And so far, I think a lot of the secularism's approach to dealing with it has created a lot of trouble. So looking down at religion, trying to stamp it out, and trying to destroy religion, you know, has brought a lot of trouble. And so the best, and religion can also, when you try to marginalize it, it can come back and become a monster, like, you know, in the United States, we have, you know, a lot of people who feel like they have been marginalized and they want in. And they will use the cooperation of the big capitalists to fund the buying of American politicians to get their way in. Or it could be the other way around. It could be the big capitalists using the religious fundamentalists to make their way into Washington. But anyway, the two seem to have found good bedfellows with each other. So we need a different approach.